They held her down in a barn that smelled of dry hay and pure, unadulterated hatred. The air was thick with the dust of a dying summer and the heavy breathing of four men. One of them was Sheriff Voss, his face a cold granite mask in the flickering lantern light. Two were his deputies, hired muscle with rope-calloused hands and empty eyes. The fourth man? The fourth man was her father. He wouldn't look at her. He just held her shoulder down, his grip like iron, his knuckles white. He was a quiet man who ran the general store, a man who kept a Bible on his counter. But the Bible wasn't there tonight. Tonight something else had taken its place. Elizabeth Granger was 17 years old, and she was about to learn the price of a single act of kindness in the town of Dry Creek. Sheriff Voss pulled a long iron rod from a bucket of glowing coals. The end of it pulsed with a malevolent, cherry-red light, painting his face in the colors of hell. It wasn't just any branding iron. It was the T brand, the one used for cattle owned by the town council, the one that meant taken property. The iron hissed as it cut through the air. Elizabeth screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the vast, uncaring dark. In that moment of searing, unimaginable pain, a promise was forged in her soul. A promise written in fire and sealed with a scar. They thought they were ending her, marking her as a thing to be owned and discarded. They had no idea they had just created the one thing they should have feared most. But to understand how a girl with a laugh like wind chimes ended up branded in a barn, you have to go back. Back to the beginning of the summer. Back to the creek. Before the brand, before the silence, Elizabeth was the closest thing Dry Creek had to a wild poppy. A splash of color in a world of brown dust and faded faith. Her mother was long gone, taken by a fever that swept through town like a ghost, leaving Elizabeth with her father, a man who seemed to be fading day by day, worn down by grief and the town's suffocating judgment. The town itself was a place that held its breath. It was run by two men, Reverend Pewitt, who preached of a God of wrath and judgment from his pulpit, and Sheriff Clayton Voss, who enforced that judgment with a rifle and a spittoon. They were two sides of the same coin, a coin that always landed on fear. That spring, the fear got a name: Comanche. Riders were seen on the ridges, silent figures watching the town like hawks. They never came close, never threatened anyone, but their presence was enough. To the Reverend, they were a test from God. To the sheriff, they were a problem waiting for a bullet. To Elizabeth, they were just there, a part of the landscape, like the half-dead cottonwood trees that clawed at the sky. She wasn't afraid. She was curious, and that curiosity would be her undoing. It was a late May morning, the air still cool and sweet. She was by the creek, gathering wild mint, when she saw him. He was alone, kneeling by the water, trying to wash a long, deep gash on his arm. It wasn't a cut from a branch. It was round, angry, and bleeding badly. A bullet wound. He looked up, and his eyes met hers. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a shadow on a ridge. He was a boy, maybe a few years older than her, trying not to die. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to go back to town and forget what she saw. That was the Dry Creek way. See nothing, say nothing, feel nothing. But she saw the pain in his eyes, and she saw something else too, a quiet strength that refused to break. She reached into her apron, pulled out a long red ribbon she used to tie back her hair, and tossed it across the shallow water. He caught it. Their eyes locked for a second longer. There was no fear in his gaze, only surprise. And then a flicker of something she couldn't name. He didn't say thank you. He just nodded once, a sharp, clear acknowledgement. He wrapped the ribbon tightly around the wound, the bright red a shocking slash of color against his skin. And then he was gone, melting back into the trees like he was never there. Elizabeth's heart was hammering against her ribs. She didn't know his name then. She didn't know he was called Tacoma. She didn't know that the bullet in his arm had been fired from Sheriff Voss's own rifle during a patrol a few nights earlier. And she definitely didn't know that her simple act of kindness, that small red ribbon, had just lit a fuse. A very, very short fuse. For days she went back to the creek, telling herself it was for the mint. She never saw him. She started to think she'd imagined it. Then one morning where she'd stood, she found a small, smooth stone. It was a river rock, polished by the water, a deep, beautiful green, the kind you only found miles upstream. She snatched it up, her breath catching in her throat. It was a thank you. A message sent across a divide wider than any creek. She clutched it in her pocket, the stone warm against her palm. It felt like a secret, a dangerous, wonderful secret. But secrets don't stay buried in Dry Creek. They get dug up, twisted, and weaponized. The whispers started like smoke, sour and choking. Mrs. Blevins, the baker's wife, swore she saw Elizabeth by the river, talking to shadows. Little Timmy Hatch claimed he saw her leaving food out by the old cottonwood. It was a lie, but lies spread faster than truth in a town starved for scandal. Then someone found the red ribbon. It was snagged on a fence post on the South Trail, the trail that led into Comanche territory. The blood on it was dark and dry, but the color was unmistakable. That was all the proof they needed. Reverend Puett summoned her father to the church. The meeting was short. Elizabeth stood outside listening to the muffled, angry sounds from within. When her father came out, he walked right past her. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He looked at her like she was a stranger, a stain. That night, the Bible on the store counter was gone, and so was her father's voice. He didn't speak another word to her. The silence in their small home was heavier than any stone. 2 days later, Sheriff Voss came to the store. He wasn't alone. The two deputies were with him, their faces grim. Elizabeth was in the back weighing flour when the front door slammed open. She heard Voss's voice, low and hard. "We're here for the girl." She heard her father's reply, so quiet it was barely a whisper. "She's in the back." That was it. No protest, no defense, just surrender. He had sold her, for his store, for his place in the town, for a quiet life. The back door burst open. Before she could even scream, a rough burlap sack was pulled over her head. The world went dark, smelling of dust and rot. Strong hands grabbed her, lifted her off her feet. She kicked and fought, but it was useless. She was dragged out of the store, out of her life, and thrown into the back of a wagon. The last thing she heard before the wagon lurched forward was the sound of the general store's front door closing and the soft, final click of the lock. Her father had locked her out, forever, and her trial by fire was about to begin. She woke up in the barn, the one on the abandoned Miller property, a place kids whispered was haunted. Tonight it was. The sack was ripped from her head. The sudden lantern light was blinding. Straw stuck to her face, mixed with tears and dirt. Her arms were bound tightly behind her back, the rope already chafing her wrists raw. Then she saw them, Voss, the deputies, and her father standing in the shadows by the door, a silhouette of shame. "We're not doing this for vengeance, Elizabeth," Sheriff Voss said, his voice flat, completely devoid of emotion. He was polishing the branding iron with a rag, like he was getting ready for a day's work. "We're doing this for order, so that no one ever forgets what happens when you invite the wilderness into our town." "He was hurt," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He was just a boy." Voss looked up from the iron, and his eyes were chips of ice. "He wasn't a boy. He was a pest. And you fed him. You comforted him. You chose his side over ours." He placed the end of the iron into the bucket of coals. It began to glow. "My father?" she pleaded, looking toward the shadow in the doorway. "Please." The shadow didn't move, didn't speak. "Your father agrees," Voss said, his lips curling into a smirk. "He understands the importance of a clean slate, of cutting out the rot before it spreads." The iron was turning red now, a deep, angry pulse. One of the deputies grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back. The other ripped the side of her dress, exposing the skin of her stomach and hip. The cool night air was a cruel shock, a prelude to the fire to come. "This is a mark of shame," Reverend Puett's voice boomed from the doorway. He had arrived, holding his Bible like a shield. "But it is also a mark of mercy. We could have hanged you. Instead, we are merely defining you, so that all men will know what you are." Elizabeth stared at her father's silhouette one last time. She saw him turn away, unable to watch. But he didn't leave. He stayed. He stayed and listened. That was the moment her heart truly broke, not from the pain that was coming, but from the betrayal that had already happened. Voss pulled the iron from the fire. It lit up the barn, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. "The word is taken," he said, his voice a low growl, "because you were taken by savagery, and now you belong to no one. You are nothing but a warning." He pressed the glowing metal to her skin. The world exploded into white-hot agony. The smell of her own burning flesh filled the air. Her scream was not human. It was the sound of a soul being ripped apart. The pain wasn't just on her skin. It was inside her, branding her very essence with a single, cruel word. When they were done, they cut her ropes. They didn't say another word. Voss casually dropped the still hot iron into a bucket of water, where it sizzled and died. Then they left. All of them. Her father was the last to go, pulling the heavy barn door shut behind him, plunging her into darkness, leaving her alone on the dirty straw, shaking and broken. A girl remade by fire, her innocence burned away, leaving behind only the scar and the silent, screaming promise of a reckoning. By dawn, the pain had subsided into a throbbing, relentless ache. But it was the cold that was worse, a deep internal cold that had nothing to do with the morning chill. She crawled out of the barn. Every movement was agony. Her dress was torn and blood-stained. The rising sun felt like an accusation. She started walking. Barefoot, stumbling, she made her way back toward Dry Creek. She didn't know where else to go. It was the only home she'd ever known. She walked past the chapel, its white paint looking impossibly clean. She saw Mrs. Blevins sweeping her porch, who took one look at her and hurried inside, slamming the door. She walked past the general store, her store. The curtains were drawn, the door was locked. Her father was inside, hiding from the monster he helped create. She walked past the schoolhouse, a place where she once dreamed of being a teacher. Kids were playing in the yard. They stopped, pointed, and whispered. Their mothers quickly herded them away, shielding their eyes from the sight of her. That was worse than the hate, the silence, the invisibility. It was like she was a ghost. They hadn't just branded her, they had erased her. She was about to collapse near the edge of town when a figure approached. It was Widow Wren, an old woman who lived on her own and was considered almost as much of an outcast as Elizabeth now was. Wren had a reputation for being tough, for speaking her mind, and for not caring one bit about the town's judgment. The old woman didn't say a word. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles and sorrow. She simply wrapped a thick, tattered quilt around Elizabeth's shivering shoulders and gently guided her away from the town. They walked to a broken-down cabin at the very edge of Dry Creek's land, a place that leaned against the sky like it was too tired to stand. "You stay here," Wren said, her voice rough but kind. "They don't own the sky. They don't own the rain." She pressed a small bundle into Elizabeth's hands, some bread, dried meat, and a jar of salve. "I'll bring what I can." Elizabeth just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Her voice was gone, buried back in that barn with a piece of her soul. For weeks, she was a ghost in that ruined cabin. The world was reduced to 4 crumbling walls and the throbbing fire of her wound. The brand festered, then oozed, then slowly, agonizingly, began to scar over. At night, she would trace its shape with trembling fingers. The capital T. The letters were crude, uneven, a permanent, ugly signature of their hate. Taken. The town moved on. There was a wedding, a barn raising. The Sunday church bell rang, a hollow, mocking sound that drifted on the wind. Sometimes a rock would hit the side of her cabin in the middle of the night. Once someone carved a crude word into her door. She scrubbed it off with sand and water until her fingers were raw. She survived on what Widow Wren brought her and what she could find herself. Roots, berries, grubs. She learned the quiet rhythms of the wilderness she'd been accused of joining. Her hair grew long and tangled. Her skin toughened. Her eyes, once bright and curious, became watchful, guarded. She spoke only to herself, fragments of old songs, her mother's name, whispers of defiance. Summer bled into fall. The poppies on the hill withered and died. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, She was fetching water from the small spring behind her cabin, and she saw him, Tacoma. He was standing beneath the cottonwoods as still as the trees themselves. He looked older. His face was leaner, carved by sun and silence. He wasn't watching the town. He was watching her. The bucket slipped from her numb fingers, splashing water over her bare feet. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, and in his eyes she saw it all. He knew. The way a wild animal knows when one of its own has been caught in a trap. His gaze held no pity. Pity was an insult. It held something far more powerful. Recognition. She turned and ran, scrambling back to the safety of her broken cabin, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She bolted the door and sank to the floor, shaking. She had survived the fire. She had survived the pain. But she wasn't sure she could survive being seen. Not like that. Not by him. The next morning, a freshly cleaned rabbit lay on her doorstep. She stared at it for a long, long time. It wasn't a gift of pity. It was a gift of respect. Food, survival. He was speaking to her in the only language that mattered out here. She took it inside and cooked it over her small fire, the first real meat she'd had in weeks. As she ate, she felt a flicker of something she thought had died in the barn. A tiny, stubborn ember of strength. He had returned, and he hadn't run away from her scars. His gifts continued. A few days later, a supple deer pelt, perfectly tanned. Then a bundle of dried herbs that, when brewed into a tea, soothed the ache in her bones. He never showed himself. He was a ghost, a provider, his presence felt but never seen. Then one morning, she found a small braid of red beads on her windowsill, the exact color of the ribbon. Her breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she picked them up. It was a message. I remember. I have not forgotten your kindness. She threaded a piece of leather through the braid and tied it around her neck, tucking it beneath her dress. It lay against her skin, a secret warmth. The town, of course, noticed, or rather, they suspected. Widow Wren told her the whispers were starting again, that the branded girl was consorting with savages, that she was luring them closer to town with her wickedness. Sheriff Voss started riding by her cabin more often. He'd rein his horse in, just staring, his eyes filled with a cold, possessive rage. He had marked her. He had defined her. How dare she survive? How dare she not be broken? He'd spit tobacco juice near her small patch of herbs and then ride off. A silent threat. A reminder of his ownership. One evening, Elizabeth sat outside, watching the sunset bleed across the sky. She was tired of hiding, tired of being afraid. And then she saw him, Tacoma. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond her crumbling fence line. This time he didn't hide. He stood in the open, calm and still. She didn't run. She held his gaze. Slowly he reached into a leather pouch, pulled out a bundle, and set it on the ground. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked back into the trees. She waited until he was gone before approaching. It was food, smoked fish, dried berries, and cornmeal. Enough for a week. That night, she didn't just feel strength. She felt seen, truly seen, perhaps, for the first time in her life. Someone looked at her, the branded girl, the outcast, and saw a person worth feeding, a person worth remembering. A few days later, she woke to a strange sound, scrabbling and quiet thuds. Peeking through a crack in the wall, she saw Tacoma. He was fixing her fence. Using fresh twine and a sturdy new post, he was methodically repairing the section that had collapsed. He worked through the pre-dawn gloom, his movements efficient and silent, a ghost mending what the world had broken. When he was done, he was gone. She wanted to thank him, but she had no words, so she found her own way. She took a piece of the soft rabbit fur he'd given her and tied it to the new fence post, a silent answer to his silent care. Their strange, wordless conversation continued. He would leave food or a tool. She would leave a small carving, a bundle of mint, or a polished stone. They were two people, pushed to the edges of the world, building a bridge of silence and respect. She started to hum again, quietly at first, then louder. She planted new herbs. She patched the roof of the cabin with the deer pelt. She even took a sharp stone and carved the letter E into the wood above her door. A small act of reclamation. But peace is a fragile thing in a place like Dry Creek. Sheriff Voss rode up one afternoon, his horse stomping impatiently. He didn't dismount. "Getting comfortable out here?" he sneered. She just stared at him, her arms crossed. "I hear you've been getting visitors, leaving gifts." His eyes narrowed into slits. "You think that savage cares about you? He's using you, to get closer to the town, to mock us." She remained silent. Her silence was her shield, and it infuriated him. "I'm warning you, girl," he growled, leaning forward in his saddle. "You stop it. You send him away. Or the next fire won't be in a barn. It'll be right here, and you'll be in it." For the first time since the branding, her voice returned. It wasn't the voice of the girl she'd been. It was lower, rougher, hardened. "I already burned once, Sheriff," she said, her voice as cold as his eyes. "I'm not afraid of fire anymore." His face turned purple with rage. He spat on the ground, yanked his horse's reins, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and hatred in his wake. That night she didn't sleep. She sat by her window, the red beads clutched in her hand, and waited. Not in fear, in anticipation. A storm was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the way the wind whispered through the cracks in her cabin walls. The next day she found her herb garden trampled. The word whore was scratched into her door, right below her E. She scrubbed it off, slowly, deliberately, not with shame, with defiance. As dusk fell, she sat on her porch, watching the trail. And he came. Tacoma. This time he didn't stop at the fence. He stepped over the repaired section, walked right up to her small broken cabin, and stood before her. He was closer than he'd ever been. She could see the faint lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw. Her scar throbbed, a phantom echo of the fire. He knelt, not in supplication, but in respect. He opened his pouch and laid 3 things on the ground before her: a fire starter kit, a warm, woven blanket, and a single perfect white feather from a snow eagle, a symbol of courage and wisdom. He stood, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't need to say the words. "I will not abandon you." She found her voice again, a little stronger this time. "Tacoma," she said. It was the first time she'd ever spoken his name. It felt solid, real. He paused, halfway turned to leave. She touched the red beads at her neck. "Thank you." He gave a single, sharp nod, and then he was gone, disappearing into the twilight. Elizabeth sat on her porch long after he left, the white feather in her hand. It was as light as air, but it felt as heavy as a promise. Voss had drawn a line in the sand. He had promised her fire, and Tacoma, in his own silent way, had just promised to stand with her in the flames. The war for her soul was about to begin. The first blow in that war wasn't loud. It was quiet, insidious, and aimed not at her, but at her only link to the town. It started with Mrs. Blevins marching over to Widow Wren's home, her face red with self-righteous fury. "You've been helping her," she accused, not even waiting for Wren to open the door fully. "Taking her food, encouraging her filthiness." Widow Wren leaned against her doorframe, her face unreadable. "The girl was starving, Martha. The Bible you're so fond of quoting has a thing or two to say about that." "The Bible also speaks of casting out sinners," Mrs. Blevins shrieked. "She's got that savage coming to her cabin at all hours. I've seen him. She wears his heathen beads. She's dragging him into her bed, right on the edge of our decent town." "And what if she is?" Wren said, her voice dangerously soft. "Is her sin any worse than the one that branded a child in a barn and left her for dead?" Mrs. Blevins gasped, clutching her pearls. The branding was the town's secret shame, a thing no one spoke of aloud. That was justice. "Was it?" Wren asked. "Or was it fear? You're afraid of a girl you couldn't break, Martha. That's all this is." The encounter ended with Mrs. Blevins storming off, vowing that the town council would hear about Wren's betrayal. The next day, 3 ranch hands, men who worked for a council member, rode past Elizabeth's cabin. They didn't just ride by. They rode in slow, deliberate circles, their horses churning up the dust. One of them hurled a rock that slammed against her door. Another spat a long stream of tobacco juice that landed right in her herb garden. The third just sat on his horse, whistling a funeral dirge, a sick grin on his face. Elizabeth stood in her doorway, her arms crossed, the fire poker in her hand. She didn't flinch. She just watched them, her eyes burning with a cold fire. She held their gaze until they grew uncomfortable and finally rode off, laughing too loudly. That night she found a symbol scorched into her fence post with pitch. A cross, not the cross of the church, the cross of a target. Tacoma came the next evening. His face was grim. He'd seen the mark. She met him at the fence. "They're trying to burn me out," she said, her voice steady. He looked from the scorched post to her face. "They will not stop." "I'm not leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. This small patch of dirt, this broken down shack, it was hers. She had earned it with blood and pain. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small, carved wooden pendant. It was a wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl. The eyes were etched deep and filled with soot, making them look alive. "For courage," he said, his voice a low rumble. He handed it to her. She closed her fingers around the carving. It was still warm from his hand. 2 nights later, the real storm broke. It started with a sound outside her window. Footsteps. Heavy. More than one person. She grabbed the fire poker just as her door splintered inward, kicked off its rusted hinges. Sheriff Voss stood in the doorway, a lantern held high, his face a mask of triumph. Behind him were the same 2 deputies from the barn. "Well, well," Voss sneered, his eyes sweeping the small, clean cabin. He saw the blanket Tacoma had given her, folded neatly on her cot. He saw the bundle of pelts in the corner. "Looks like you've been doing a brisk trade." "Get out," Elizabeth said, holding the poker like a spear. "I don't think so," Voss replied, stepping inside. He nodded to his men. "We're here to conduct a search for stolen goods." It was a lie, and they all knew it. One of the deputies lunged for her. She swung the heavy iron poker with all her might. It connected with his shoulder with a sickening crunch. He howled in pain and stumbled back. The second man came at her, but a shadow moved in the ruined doorway, a blur of silent, coiled fury. Tacoma. He hit the deputy like a thunderclap, tackling him to the floor. The man's head hit the stone hearth with a crack. The lantern crashed to the floor, shattering. Oil and flame spread instantly, licking up the dry wooden walls. The room exploded in light and smoke. Voss, shocked, drew his pistol, but Tacoma was faster. He launched himself across the small room, not at Voss, but at his gun arm. He knocked it upward just as the sheriff fired. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet tore through the roof, sending a shower of splinters down. In the chaos, Elizabeth scrambled for the fallen deputy's rifle. Her fingers closed around the cold steel. She didn't hesitate. She cocked it and aimed it squarely at the sheriff's chest. Her hands were perfectly steady. "Leave," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. Voss stared at her over the barrel of the rifle. He saw the girl he'd branded, the victim he'd tried to erase. But that girl was gone. In her place was a woman made of iron and fire. He then looked at Tacoma, who now stood beside her, a silent, lethal promise. He wiped a smear of blood from his lip where he'd been hit. "You just made your choice," he snarled. "I made it a long time ago," she replied. "The night you and my father left me to die." Voss's eyes flickered with surprise. He hadn't expected that. He backed away slowly, dragging his injured men with him. They retreated into the night, their eyes burning with a hatred that was now mingled with a new, unwelcome emotion. Fear. When they were gone, the only sound was the crackle of the flames. Together, Elizabeth and Tacoma used the blanket to beat out the fire, stamping out the last embers with their feet. The cabin was a wreck. The door was broken, a wall was scorched black, and the air was thick with smoke. Elizabeth sank to the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, the rifle still clutched in her hands. The adrenaline faded, leaving her shaking. Her scar, the one under her dress, throbbed with a fiery phantom pain. Tacoma crouched beside her. The firelight from the hearth played across his face, making it impossible to read his expression. He was silent for a long time. Then slowly, gently, he reached out a hand. She flinched instinctively, A lifetime of hurt coiled in that small movement. But she didn't pull away. His fingers brushed against the torn fabric of her dress, near the place where the brand was hidden. His eyes asked a silent question. She gave a single tiny nod. With infinite care, he lifted the rough cloth, just enough to reveal the scar. It was ugly in the flickering light, a silvery puckered ruin of flesh that spelled out her shame. Taken. His gaze didn't waver. He didn't look away. He didn't show pity. Then he did something that changed everything. He laid his hand flat over the scar. His palm was warm, calloused and strong. He wasn't pressing, just covering it, shielding it, claiming it not as a brand of shame, but as a part of her story. He looked up, his dark eyes locking with hers, and he whispered a single word. Mine. It wasn't a word of ownership, like Voss's brand. It wasn't a claim. It was a recognition, an acceptance. It was him saying, this pain, this mark, this story, I see it. I honor it. I will share its weight. A sharp, painful breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes stung with tears she hadn't shed since that night in the barn. But she didn't cry. Instead, she leaned into him, just slightly, resting her head against his shoulder. She could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady, a rhythm of survival. He didn't speak again. He just stayed there, his hand covering her scar, until the shaking stopped. When he finally stood to leave, he gently touched her hair, then stepped out into the wounded night. Elizabeth watched him go. The cabin was half destroyed. The town wanted her dead. But for the first time since she was a little girl, she didn't feel alone. She had been branded taken. But in the ashes of her broken home, she had just been found. The air in Dry Creek grew colder after that night, a chill that had nothing to do with the coming winter. It was the cold of a decision being made, a gathering of wolves. Sheriff Voss didn't come back, not the next day or the day after. His absence was more terrifying than his presence. It was the quiet before a lightning strike. The town was holding its breath, waiting for him to make his move. Elizabeth knew what was coming. She'd seen this kind of hatred before. It couldn't be left to fester. It had to be acted upon. They hadn't broken her with fire, so they would try again with rope. She spent her days preparing, not to run, but to fight. She sharpened the blade of an old scythe she found in the barn. She repaired her door as best she could. She gathered herbs not for healing, but for hiding her scent if she needed to slip into the woods. Tacoma returned on the third evening. He didn't bring gifts. He didn't wait at the fence. He walked straight to the scorched door, and for the first time, he stepped inside her home without being invited. The space was too small for his presence, yet he fit perfectly within it. They are gathering men, he said, his voice low. There was no preamble. From the next county over. Men who don't know you. Men who will do what they're told for coin. Elizabeth was cleaning the rifle, her movements methodical. They won't come to frighten me this time. No, he said. They will come to finish it. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his in the dim light of the hearth. This isn't your fight, Tacoma. You could be miles from here before they even ride out. He walked over to the small window and looked out toward the distant, judgmental lights of Dry Creek. I gave a boy a red ribbon by a creek, he said, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. That was my choice. This is the consequence. He turned back to her. I stay. It wasn't an offer. It was a fact, as solid and unchangeable as the mountains on the horizon. That night, they sat with their backs against opposite walls, the rifle between them. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They were two soldiers in a war only they understood, waiting for the final battle. The quiet in the cabin was no longer empty. It was full of courage. The next morning it began. The chapel bell started to ring, not the cheerful Sunday morning peal, a single solemn toll over and over, a summons, a death knell. Widow Wren appeared at the edge of the clearing just before noon. She was breathless, her shawl clutched tightly around her. It's a public reckoning, she gasped, her voice laced with fury. Reverend Pewitt is calling it a trial to restore moral order. They've sent for Judge Miller, a man who believes the only good Comanche is a dead one and the only good woman is a silent one. She looked at Elizabeth, her old eyes fierce. They'll make it look like justice. They'll talk of God and sin and the safety of the town. But it's a lynching, Elizabeth, and you're the guest of honor. The old woman pressed a heavy parcel into her hands. They expect you to come in broken, terrified. Don't you give them the satisfaction. Elizabeth unwrapped it. Inside was a simple dress of clean, undyed homespun cotton and a single beautiful silver hairpin, its head intricately carved with the shape of wild poppies. It was my mother's, Wren said softly. She wore it when she went before the council to fight for her land. They didn't listen to her. They took the land anyway. But they never forgot her face. They never forgot the way she looked them in the eye. Elizabeth understood. This wasn't just a dress. It was armor. This wasn't just a pin. It was a sword. As the sun began its slow, bloody descent, they came. Sheriff Voss led the posse. 10 men, all mounted, all armed. Behind them, in a wagon, sat Reverend Pewitt, his Bible held aloft like a weapon. A crowd of townsfolk followed, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and grim satisfaction. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, a line of silent accusers. They expected her to cower in her cabin, to be dragged out, screaming and fighting. But the door of the cabin opened, and Elizabeth walked out. She wore the simple white dress. Her wild copper hair was not tangled and free, but braided back neatly, held in place by a single silver pin that caught the last rays of the dying sun. The wolf pendant Tacoma had given her was tucked beneath her collar. Her head was high. Her back was straight. She looked like a queen surveying a kingdom of fools. Tacoma walked out behind her. He was unarmed. His hands were open at his sides. He walked not behind her, but beside her, an equal, a partner. Together they walked toward the town, toward the gallows they had prepared for her. The crowd parted before them, a wave of whispers and shocked silence. They met in the center of the dusty main street. Reverend Pewitt was the first to speak, his voice a booming, theatrical roar. Behold the sinner! This woman was given a chance at redemption, a place in our community. And she chose instead the path of darkness, consorting with the heathens who plague our lands. Elizabeth looked not at the crowd, but directly at the Reverend. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through his sermon like a knife. You didn't brand me for sinning, Reverend, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. You branded me for not hating who you told me to hate. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Silence! Pewitt shrieked, his face turning beet red. You seduced this savage. You flaunted his corruption in the face of this good, God-fearing town. Tacoma stepped forward slightly. His voice was quiet, but it held the power of the mountains. She gave me cloth for a wound when I was bleeding. Your sheriff gave me the wound. You call her action corruption? Another shockwave went through the crowd. They knew Voss patrolled the territories, but this was the first they'd heard he'd actually shot someone. Voss stepped forward, his hand on his pistol. This isn't your land, savage. You have no voice here. The land was here long before your town, Tacoma replied, his eyes burning with a sorrowful fire. And it will be here long after your hate has turned to dust. That's enough, Voss roared. He pointed a thick finger at Elizabeth. There will be a trial. The judge will decide your fate. What trial? Elizabeth's voice rang out stronger now. There was no trial the night you and my father dragged me from my home in a sack. There was no judge in that barn, only a hot iron and cowards hiding in the dark. The crowd was shifting uncomfortably. Women were looking at their husbands. Men were staring at the ground. You were spared, Voss growled. We could have hanged you then. You didn't spare me, she said, taking a step forward. The crowd gasped. You marked me. You branded me like an animal so that no one would ever want me. So I would live out my days in silence and shame, a walking ghost to remind everyone of your power. She paused, letting her words sink in. But I didn't rot, she said, her voice dropping to a powerful, resonant whisper. I didn't die. I lived. I healed. And I remembered everything. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the eaves of the buildings. Then Elizabeth did the one thing they never expected. She reached up to the collar of her dress. Slowly, deliberately, She undid the top buttons. She pushed the fabric aside, exposing her skin, exposing the scar. In the fading light, it was a pale silver ruin, ugly, permanent, a testament to their cruelty. Taken. You did this, she said, her voice breaking with emotion but not with weakness. You wrote your hate on my skin. You tried to turn me into a thing, but you failed. A woman in the crowd, Mrs. Gable, whose son Elizabeth used to babysit, let out a soft sob and covered her mouth. A rancher took off his hat as if in the presence of the dead. Sheriff Voss, his authority crumbling, his narrative shattered, completely lost control. He lunged forward, his hand raised to strike her, to silence her once and for all. But Tacoma moved like lightning. He didn't attack. He simply stepped between them. Voss's open-handed slap, meant for Elizabeth's face, landed squarely on Tacoma's shoulder with a loud smack. And then, stillness. Tacoma didn't flinch. He didn't raise a hand in retaliation. He just stood there, a granite wall between the lawman's violence and the woman he was protecting. He absorbed the blow. He took the hate. Voss stared, his hand still tingling. He had expected a fight. He had wanted a fight. A fight would have justified everything. This quiet, powerful defiance, it unmanned him. Touch her again, Tacoma said, his voice a low, deadly promise. And I will not be still. And that's when the spell broke. From the back of the crowd, a man's voice called out, "Leave them be, Voss. They ain't hurting no one." Another voice, a woman's, joined in. "She's right. It was you who hurt her." Reverend Pewitt tried to rally them, sputtering about sin and damnation, but his words were empty now. The crowd wasn't listening. They were looking at Elizabeth, not at the branded outcast, but at the survivor, standing tall and unbroken. Widow Wren stepped forward, placing a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. "You wanted us to see her shame," she said to the crowd, "but I see her courage. You wanted us to see a sinner. I see a miracle." Then from the edge of the crowd, Elizabeth's father stepped out of the shadows. His face was a wreck of tears and a year of guilt. He looked at his daughter, at the scar she bore because of his cowardice. He looked at Sheriff Voss, and he said two words: "No more." It was over. The hatred had been exposed, and in the light of truth, it withered. Voss and his men, defeated not by violence but by courage, slowly backed away. The crowd began to disperse, not in anger, but in quiet, heavy contemplation. Elizabeth looked at Tacoma, and for the first time, in the middle of the street, in front of what was left of the town, she reached out and took his hand. He laced his fingers through hers. Together they turned their backs on Dry Creek and walked away. They walked past the chapel, past the general store, past the schoolhouse. They walked toward the ridgeline, where the sky was open and the land was free. They didn't look back. Later that night, in her small, scorched cabin, Elizabeth took the silver hairpin from her hair and placed it on the windowsill. The wolf pendant lay beside it. The moonlight streamed in, illuminating her name, the E she had carved, a testament to her survival. Tacoma sat by the hearth, not as a visitor, but as a partner. The silence between them was no longer about survival. It was about peace. She had been marked. She had been exiled. She had been hunted. They had tried to take everything from her, her voice, her name, her spirit. But in the end, she had taken it all back. If you're listening to this, and you've ever been marked by someone else's hate, by a word or a scar you didn't ask for, remember this story. Remember Elizabeth Granger. Your scars don't define your worth. They are proof of your strength. They are the map of where you've been, but they do not dictate where you are going. You are not what they tried to carve into you. You are what you choose to build in spite of it. Sometimes the greatest victory is not in fighting back with fire, but in simply refusing to burn. It's in surviving, in healing, and in reclaiming your own name. And if you're lucky someday, someone will look at the deepest, most painful part of you, and they won't see something broken. They'll see a survivor, and they'll whisper the one word that can heal almost anything: mine. Not to own you, but to see you, to share the weight, to stand with you. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, and you want to hear more tales of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then be sure to hit that subscribe button. Thank you for listening.